paper titled The Form of a Woman, Memorializing Wartime Rape in the European and Pacific Theaters of World War II. Soldiers of opposing camps, whether they identified as Allied or Axis powers, brutally raped women during World War II. Yet these victims of rape have been left out of the memorial landscape until recently. In the Pacific Theater, the Japanese Imperial Army from 1932 to 1945 coerced tens and thousands of Asian women into the depraved comfort system. On the Eastern Front, approximately 20,000 German women were raped by Soviet soldiers during liberation from 1945 to 1949. This paper analyzes two recent representations of wartime rape. For the Pacific Theater, I will focus on a comfort woman memorial entitled The Statue of Peace, erected in Seoul, South Korea. And for the Eastern Front, I will analyze a counter-memorial that briefly stood in Danzig, Poland, entitled Kommfrau, meaning come woman in German. In the 1990s, the scholarship on the ubiquitous nature of rape and genocidal rape, wartime rape and genocidal rape, accelerated in conjunction with the memory boom, which prompted scholars to propound on collective memory, limits of representation of trauma, and sites of memory. My work weaves the two historiographical threads together to specifically trace the memorial representations of rape during World War II. At present, comfort women are much more publicly and internationally memorialized compared to those raped by the Red Army. The goal of this paper is to analyze the design, place, and popular response of each memorial in relation to each region's historical and socio-political context. That speaks to the growing desire to carve out spaces of remembrance for these victims and point to why there is such a disproportional representation. The first aspect focuses on the subject of the statue and how the form attempts to depict the crime or the victim. The second focuses on site, its significance, and how it fits into the existing landscape. And the third aspect assesses the international and local responses. The physical representations and materiality of each work are charged with symbolism and realism that either empower the victim or expose the darker elements of rape. My central question, the through line of my paper, how does one culturally depict the crime of rape and memorialize mass rape on the behalf of the victims in a way that is dignified? In answering this question, I will analyze arguably the most well-known bronze girl. She is known as the Statue of Peace, erected in Seoul on December 14, 2011, directly outside the Japanese embassy. Kim Soi-kyung and Kim Young-sung's sculpture depicted a dignified young woman with cropped hair, a look of determination that the artist put as the look of a scolding grandmother. She is modestly dressed in a hanbok and sits barefoot with an empty chair beside her, which represents those who have died, and pulls the spectator in. She is not simply a statue. Rather, she is uniquely engaged with and impacted passers-by in a remarkable way. The activism and performance between the comfort women and the public has enabled the bronze girl to transcend her material form. The Statue of Peace inscription reads, December 14, 2011 marks the 1000th Wednesday demonstration for the solution of the Japanese military sexual slavery issue. This peace monument stands to commemorate the spirit and deep history of the Wednesday demonstrations. This inscription emphasizes the spirit and the history of the demonstrations, rather than the crime itself. The Wednesday demonstrations were weekly protests held in South Korea by the Korean Council demanding Japanese reparations, in 1992, which is when many comfort women began coming forward and sharing their experiences. The sexual violence is not depicted in the work. The artist's work prioritizes the comfort woman's agency, consequently replacing the victim with the protester. The artists depict an innocent adolescent girl infused with subtle characteristics of an aging woman to symbolize the arc of the survivors' lives. Everyday spectators regularly dress the bronze girl with hats, scarves, and coats, and usually leave gifts, usually yellow slippers, symbolic of the Wednesday demonstrations. The public has engaged with her so much so that she has transcended her form, and in 2017, replicas of her sat on South Korean buses, which forced Koreans to deal with this difficult past. The Statue of Peace in Seoul aptly demonstrates how rape memorials do not only render what these women endured, but can be imbued with a spirit of activism and invoke how many noble actors continue to fight for redress. I found these memorials an incredibly meaningful form of redress. And the fact that many of these survivors are still alive and telling their stories it accounts for why these memorials have taken on performative and animated functions in South Korea. In contrast to the expanding discourse on comfort women memorials, the German rape victim has remained relatively invisible in the German and Eastern European landscape. One explanation of this difference is that German women were not perceived as victims, and the mass rape of the Red Army was not prosecuted at Nuremberg. The pre-1989 pro-communist memorial landscape, according to historian Tony Judt, was the result of the Sovietization of Eastern Europe and has been increasingly challenged due to the withering way of the master narrative. Pain, outrage, and a desire for justice differentiates the two contexts. So, this is my next memorial. This is my next section, which will examine the unconventional and controversial counter-memorial to the German women raped by the Red Army, in a landscape which is void of memorials that challenge the darker elements of Soviet liberation. Scholars have confirmed that the Soviet Spring Offensive resulted in 1.9 million German women raped. So this is Frau, and she energized and politicized the memorial debates by creating a memorial depicting a rape scene. She was erected by the Polish art student Jeremy Sumchek in dance on October 12, 2013. The statue was inspired by his own independent research, and his shocking statue was strategically and illicitly erected at night next to a Soviet Liberation Memorial. The Gorilla Memorial portrayed a 300-kilo, slightly larger than life, concrete sculpture of a Soviet soldier identifiable as Russian by the emblazoned star on his helmet, kneeling between the legs of a heavily pregnant woman lying on the ground. The Soviet soldier's pants are pulled down while he's holding her hand in his left hand, and he's putting a pistol into her mouth with his right. In an interview about 2 weeks after Frau was erected, Sumchek reflected, "I also thought about the men. The soldiers were usually the heroes in victory memorials, and then I came up with the form of a woman. I started to think why there are no women in these statues. It's always a man, a hero, a victor. I thought about making a statue of the victim, deprived of glory." But he did not create just a woman, but a pregnant woman in a vulnerable and powerless position. Her legs are splayed open while she is trapped beneath the Russian soldier who violently shoves a gun into her mouth. Unlike the comfort women memorials, portrayed the victims in a dignified and tasteful manner, not at all reminiscent of the act of rape, Sumchek represented a woman truly deprived of glory, and the potentially monstrous nature of man. Although in his interview he expressed a desire to avoid depicting a man, a hero, a victor, his male subject, a despicable rapist, is still depicted elevated in a position of power, assaulting the woman. In a sense, it subjects the victims to the horror again, therefore not a memorial on behalf of them. Another problematic aspect of the brutal realism is that it taps into the deeper issues of the aestheticization of sexual violence. Sumchek was arrested hours later on the grounds that it incited national and racial hatred, and the sculpture was removed. The Soviet memorial captured only one artist's discontent and was not truly a memorial that carved out a permanent space for its survivors. In other words, the counter-memorial just responded to the vacuous absence of a conversation about the rape with one man's outrage. The arresting and imagined rape scene was a shocking confrontation with that silence and humanized the victims of what is usually thought of as an event of only political causes. And the enemy was not just a political one, but one that might exist in all of us, thus depoliticizing the event. While there are obvious differences, Frau rebelled against the neighboring Soviet tank in the same way the demure Korean bronze girl sat silently and indignantly outside the Japanese embassy. However, the bronze girl figuratively sits in solidarity alongside the 40-plus comfort women memorials around the world. Frau ignited impassioned debates. One commentator claimed the sculpture represented the silent screams of the victim. Another was angered by the impropriety of the disturbing pose. One journalist admitted to commemorate victims of rape. Examining a number of representations of rape has led me to question whether the act of rape should be veiled and avoided when memorializing victims and survivors. Are comfort women memorials publicly accepted because of their innocuous and modest form, which makes them more palatable and more likely to be transplanted in regions that are unrelated to the memory of that event. Unlike the Korean artist's approach, some Shik unabashedly made the physical act of rape the centerpiece of his sculpture, and consequently, Kampfrau was forcibly removed. The rape of the German women once again vanished from the landscape. So in conclusion, we return to my initial question. How does one culturally depict the crime of rape and memorialize mass rape on behalf of the victims in a dignified way? Public commemoration and representation of mass rape discussed in this paper has reflected greater international awareness, but the meaning of awareness and modes of dealing with that rape differs depending on place and context. In one context, the need to graphically shake the audience into a conversation coexists alongside another's context to be subtle, to suggest pain and absence, but to not focus on the crime. Both contexts need to work together to inject a human element into the violent event, encapsulating the experience of rape in the form of a solitary woman. That regardless of numbers, rape is an assault on the individual woman, and trauma is felt most directly by that woman. Memorializing crimes against humanity, in particular crimes against women, corrects and complicates the memory landscape of World War II. Thank you.